Hi everyone, I'm Dean Friedman, Director of the New York School of Synthesis. Here to tell you everything you need to know about the reproductive processes of the yellow speckle-bellied salamander.
Dean!
Sorry. Correction. Actually, I'm here to explain everything there is to know about music synthesis and how to make sounds on all these neat, amazing synthesizers. So please excuse the dumb jokes, but let's face it, this subject is very boring. However, if you're patient and bear with me, I'll try and make it as painless as possible for you. So, ready? Here's what you're going to learn in this three-part series. First, we're going to talk a little bit about sound and how all sounds are made up of vibrations. Then we're going to talk about the three elements of sound, and they are pitch, timbre, and volume. Learn how to control these three elements of sound, and you'll actually be able to modify existing sounds or design from scratch any sound you can imagine. And once we've talked about the three elements of sound, we'll go on to examine the five most common waveforms: the square wave, the sawtooth wave, the triangle wave, the pulse wave, and the sine wave. Every synthesizer under the sun uses at least two or three of these waveforms to either generate or modulate part of the sound. And finally, once you know one waveform from another, we will cover the 7 main components of a synthesizer. And just in case you're curious about those 7 main components, they are the oscillator, the amplifier, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. And that's it. Really, once you understand about vibration, about the 3 elements of sound, about the 5 most common waveforms, and finally the 7 main components of a synthesizer, you will be well on your way to designing your very own sounds on your very own synthesizer. Sounds easy, huh? Well, actually, it's not all that hard once you've got these basic concepts down. And by the way, these rules of sound apply to every synthesizer ever made, old or new, whether you're talking about a Yamaha DX11 or a Roland Juno 1 or a Korg M1 or an Oberheim Matrix 12, this information still applies. All synths have envelopes. All synths have oscillators. All synths have some kind of an LFO. The approaches may be different, but the general principles of sound are still the same. So, ready? Because here we go. All sounds are made up of vibrations. Plug a string on a guitar, and the vibration travels from the string through the air into your ear, where you hear it as a sound. The same with a saxophone. Blow into the mouthpiece, and you cause the wooden reed to vibrate. A hammer striking a piano string, the mouthpiece of a trumpet. All these things generate vibrations which travel through the air to our ears, where we hear the vibrations as sound. Now, in a synthesizer, we create sound by setting up electrical vibrations in the circuitry. When these electrical vibrations are amplified and sent to a speaker, they cause the speaker to vibrate, and just like the guitar string or the saxophone reed, the vibration in the speaker travels through the air and we hear it as sound. Synthesized sound. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? Because a lot of what you do on a synthesizer has to do with controlling vibrations. All right, let's go over some necessary shop talk regarding sound and vibration, just so you don't sound stupid at cocktail parties when people start talking about sound vibrations. Here's some basic terminology. A simple unit of vibration is referred to as a cycle. The number of cycles that occur in a given time period is referred to as frequency. In other words, frequency refers to the speed of a vibration. The number of cycles or individual vibrations that occur in a single second are referred to as hertz. Not the rent-a-car, but hertz. In other words, if a note on a trumpet vibrates at a rate of, say, 440 times a second, we say that the note has a frequency of 440 hertz. The term kilohertz equals 1,000 hertz. So if we say a sound has a frequency of 5 kilohertz, or 5K, we mean that it has a frequency of 5,000 cycles a second. That is, it's vibrating 5,000 times a second. Just so you have some frame of reference for all this let's talk about the audible frequency range. The audible frequency range is the frequency range in which we, as humans, as opposed to porcupines or wombats, are capable of perceiving sound. This range falls between 20 hertz and 20K. That is, between 20 vibrations a second and 20,000 vibrations a second. Anything that falls within that range, we will hear as sound. Anything that falls above or below that range will not be discernible to us. Now, as some of you no doubt know, dogs are capable of hearing frequencies which are higher than that. They can hear sounds that we can't hear. And it was only discovered recently that elephants are capable of discerning frequencies which are in fact much lower than the audible frequency range for humans. Maybe those big ears have something to do with it. I don't know. In fact, some people postulate that homing pigeons navigate by being able to hear the sub-audio frequencies which are generated by mountain ranges and the movement of the continental plates. Strange but true. Anyway, the point of all this is that vibrations in a given range make sounds that we hear. And all the terms I just mentioned, cycle, frequency, hertz, kilohertz, all these terms have to do with the sound's vibration. Learning how to control and manipulate these vibrations is what music synthesis is all about. So let's talk more about these sound vibrations. First of all, how is it we can tell one sound from another? How do we differentiate a trumpet sound from, say, an electric guitar sound? And for that matter, when we hear two different notes played on the same instrument, how do we tell those two notes apart? Well, different sounds are created by different kinds of vibrations. And in order to discuss those differences, we need to examine the three main elements of sound. And they are pitch, timbre, and volume. Having fun so far? Listen, all sounds can be described in terms of these three main elements. So let's start with pitch. Actually, pitch is just the musical term for frequency. If a sound has a frequency of 440 hertz, that means it has a pitch of A above middle C. In fact, anything that vibrates at a rate of 440 times a second is going to generate the pitch of A. A guitar string or a saxophone reed, even a building. If a building were to vibrate 440 times a second, it would fall down. But as it was falling down, you would hear a big A. So, pitch equals frequency. In sound, the higher the rate of vibration, the higher the pitch, and vice versa. The lower the frequency of a sound, the lower its pitch. And we can use this basic principle of pitch when we sit down to design sounds. If you're trying to synthesize the sound of a high-pitched instrument, such as a flute or piccolo, you reach for the part of the synthesizer that controls frequency, the oscillator, and dial up a high frequency. If you're trying to create a fat bass sound, you dial up a low frequency. In its simplest terms, controlling pitch allows you to establish a range for your sound, be it high, medium, or low. But more than that, being able to control pitch opens up the door to a whole range of sound design options like chorusing, vibrato, programmed pitch bend, and stuff like that. That's pitch. Now let's talk about timbre, or timbre, as lumberjacks say. Timbre refers to a sound's unique character. Timbre has to do with the sound's color, its tone, that is, its brightness or darkness. Timbre is how we tell the sound of a trumpet from the sound of an oboe, even if they're playing the same exact pitch. A sound's timbre has to do with its harmonic structure. And in order to define timbre, we first have to understand all about harmonics. Okay, you with me so far? Remember, before you start to make sounds by twiddling with knobs and sliders, you need to understand what sound is made up of. So, harmonics. Here's a useful analogy. When a painter paints a picture of the sky, odds are good that the first thing he'll do is grab a tube of blue paint. But that's not all. Depending on the particular kind of sky he wants to paint, cloudy or clear, he may grab a tube of white or gray or yellow or even red, and what he'll do is mix and combine those colors and hues in appropriate amounts to achieve the particular shade of blue sky he has in mind. True, the sky is still blue, and blue is the main paint color used in the sky, but in fact it's a composite blue, made up of various shades and hues, all contributing to the unique quality and character of this particular blue sky. A composite color. Sound is color. In fact, I'm not just being poetic when I say that. They are, after all, just different ends of the energy spectrum, sound and light. Just as our blue sky is made up of various colors, most sounds are made up of various frequencies. In other words, they are composite sounds. When you hear the note C played on a trumpet, you're not just hearing that C. You're hearing an octave above that C, a G a fifth above the octave, another octave C, the E a third above that. In fact, you're hearing an entire series of related frequencies, all of which combine in varying amounts to the unique quality of the main frequency of C. Just as those other colors combine to create a particular kind of blue, these other frequencies combine to create a particular kind of C. C is still the main frequency. It is the lowest frequency in the sound as well as the loudest, but it is not alone. The fact of its being the loudest and lowest means that we discern its pitch above all of the other frequencies, and as the main frequency, we refer to it as the fundamental. All the other frequencies that make up the composite sound are called harmonics, or overtones, or partials. Those three terms, harmonics, overtones, and partials, all refer to the same thing, those upper frequencies above the fundamental which when combined give a sound its unique tone, its timbre. We call this arrangement a sound's harmonic spectrum. And what's important to realize is that the arrangement of these harmonics in pitched instruments is not random. In fact, they fall into a very fixed and predictable pattern, which we call the natural harmonic series. When I refer to pitched instruments, I mean any instrument like a piano, guitar, brass, woodwind, that produces a discernible pitch, a musical note, as opposed to non-pitched percussive instruments like drums, bells, cymbals, woodblocks, and the like. The difference is that pitched instruments have a very orderly and predictable harmonic spectrum, as I just said, the natural harmonic series, whereas non-pitched instruments like drums and bells don't. You see, if you examine the harmonic relationship in a pitched instrument, you'll discover a very strict mathematical ratio between the fundamental and its harmonics. The frequency of the harmonics in ascending order will be 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the fundamental, and so on. These are all whole number multiples of the fundamental. On the other hand, on non-pitched instruments, the composite frequencies have very irregular and unpredictable relationships. In fact, it's often difficult on non-pitched instruments to determine the fundamental pitch at all. Take a bell, for example. Instead of a bell's harmonics being 2, 3, or 4 times the fundamental, they might be 2.7 times or 1/3 times the fundamental, an irregular harmonic relationship which results in a characteristic non-pitched dissonant sound. So why am I telling you all this? Well, because once you understand the ingredients of timbre and how to manipulate harmonics, you can then create your own timbres. For example, let's apply our knowledge of harmonics to making a simple bell. Now, I just told you a moment ago that one characteristic of a bell sound is that its harmonics are not whole number multiples of the fundamental. That, in fact, the harmonics of a bell are irregular or dissonant. Let's hear what that actually means. First, I'll design a basic bell-like envelope. A short attack and a long release. Now, using my knowledge of pitch, I'll dial up a high frequency. Almost bell-like, but not quite. Now let's try adding a harmonic that is obviously dissonant and see what happens to the character of the sound. You can hear how by simply introducing a single dissonant harmonic into a sound, you can go a long way towards capturing the unique metallic element which is characteristic of a bell sound. The point is we're able to achieve this effect on purpose, using a basic understanding of harmonics. So we've established that the harmonic content of a sound is responsible for its timbre. Now understand that in its simplest form, controlling timbre is simply a matter of making a sound brighter or darker. If a sound has a lot of upper harmonics, it will be bright. If it has mostly lower harmonics and fundamental, it will be dark. On a typical analog or hybrid synth, we would achieve that by opening or closing the filter. As we open the filter, we allow the higher harmonics to be heard. The sound gets brighter. As we close the filter, we remove the upper harmonics, leaving mostly the fundamental, making the sound darker. If we close the filter almost completely, we're left with pure fundamental, no harmonics. Okay, we've discussed pitch and we've discussed timbre. And if you've been paying attention, instead of playing with your belly button lip, then you should understand that whereas pitch refers to the main or fundamental frequency of a sound, timbre refers to an assortment of frequencies called harmonics, which are related to the main frequency called the fundamental. Got it? You sure? Okay. Let's continue. Let's talk about volume. Folks, how on earth can we sell synthesizer videos at such incredibly low prices? Well, I'll tell you. The answer is volume, volume, volume. Just kidding. Actually, the main aspect of volume has to do with the overall shape of a sound. Some sounds, like a piano sound, start abruptly with a sudden attack and then die out gradually. Other sounds, like a bowed violin, start gradually. They have a slow attack and they die out gradually. Different sounds have different shapes, and these shapes are a function of volume. We refer to a sound's overall shape as its volume envelope. Let's look at that bowed string sound again. It starts in silence at 0 volume, and then gradually the volume increases. It reaches a peak volume level, and then it sustains for as long as the note is held down. Then, once you release the note, it gradually fades out back into silence. The increases and decreases in volume are what give the note its shape, its volume envelope. Just as we have a way of controlling pitch using a frequency control, and just as we control timbre using some kind of filter control, there's a section on every synthesizer that allows you to design the shape or volume envelope of a sound. And that's called the volume envelope. Listen to what happens when I take this nice string sound and give it a sudden attack instead of a gradual one. And a quick release instead of a gradual one. And no sustain at all. This is how it used to sound. Now here's how it sounds. You can see how drastically you can change a sound by altering its volume envelope. We'll talk more about the volume envelope in a while. For now, just try and understand that any sound can be described in terms of these 3 elements: pitch, timbre, and volume. And each of these aspects of a sound can then be addressed on a corresponding component on a synthesizer. You want to affect the sound's pitch, you reach for the frequency control of the oscillator. You want to affect the sound's timbre or its brightness, you reach for the filter, or in the case of an FM synth, you look for the modulator. you want to alter the overall shape of a sound, you reach for the volume envelope. The point is, if you understand the elements of sound, you'll be able to program any synthesizer. Because all synthesizers, regardless of make or model number, have to obey the same principles of sound. They all have to somehow address those same three elements: pitch, timbre, and volume. Okay, you can go take a break now, eat a bowl of Cheerios or something. Ready to continue? Here we go. The 5 most common waveforms. They are the square wave, the sawtooth wave, the triangle wave, the pulse wave, and the sine wave. All synths will employ at least 2 or 3 of these different waveforms. So, from the top, the square wave. All right, imagine your name is Bob Moog, and you're sitting down to invent the modern synthesizer. And you say to yourself, okay, I need to generate an electronic signal, some constantly repeating vibration, to produce a synthesized sound. So how do I do it easily and inexpensively? Well, the easiest way to create an electrical vibration is to do this. Turn something on and off real fast. Do it fast enough, say 440 times a second, and you create an electronically synthesized sound. Well, that's not that hard to do. There are circuits that go instantly on and then instantly off, or positive and then negative, and that's what he did. The result is a vibration called the square wave. The name describes the shape of a single cycle of the waveform. The sound of a square wave is round with a little bit of edge. Well, that wasn't so hard. We have a waveform that goes instantly on for half a cycle and then goes instantly off for half a cycle. What happens if we make a wave that goes instantly on and then gradually off? Well, you get a sawtooth wave, or what's sometimes called a ramp wave. The sound of a sawtooth wave is rather buzzy with a lot of edge, as opposed to the square wave. So, we have a square wave which goes instantly on and then instantly off. A sawtooth wave that goes instantly on and then gradually off. What if we make a wave that goes gradually on and then gradually off? It's called a triangle wave. The sound of a triangle wave is round and pure with almost no edge or buzziness. Square, sawtooth, triangle. The other good thing about the triangle wave is that it doesn't sound anything like the square wave or the sawtooth wave, thereby providing a variety of different waveforms to choose from when selecting source material for a sound. So, what do you know? So far, we've got 3 different waveforms, all relatively easy to generate, with 3 drastically different sounds. Variety at a bargain price. Next, let's talk about the pulse wave. You know how in geometry, a square is actually a special kind of a rectangle with equal sides and angles. Well, a square wave is actually a special kind of pulse wave. You see, a pulse wave is just like a square wave, in that it goes instantly on and then instantly off, except that whereas a square wave is up 50% of the time and then down 50% of the time, a pulse wave can be up 30% of the time and down 70% of the time, or up 25% and down 75%. A pulse wave is variable, sort of like adjustable roller skates. You change the proportions of a pulse wave to suit your needs. And as you change the ratio, or what's called the duty cycle of a pulse wave, you also change its sound. In other words, you can get many different waveforms for the price of one. The pulse wave can sound either thin and reedy, when the duty cycle is around 10 or 15%, or it can sound round with a little edge, when the duty cycle is at 50%. And in fact, when you set the duty cycle of a pulse wave so that the ratio is 50-50, what you actually have is a square wave. Usually any synthesizer that offers you a pulse wave will offer you the means with which to change the width of the pulse wave. you see, when the pulse wave has a duty cycle of 50%, it actually is a square wave. Got it? Good. So we've got the square wave, the sawtooth or ramp wave, the triangle wave, and the pulse wave, which is like the square wave but variable. And finally, let's talk about the sine wave. A sine wave is a single pure frequency. Just as an atom is the smallest building block of matter, a sine wave is the smallest building block of sound. When we refer to a sound's timbre and its harmonic spectrum being made up of numerous frequencies, those individual frequencies are actually sine waves, pure vibrations. The fundamental frequency is also a single sine wave. It's when we start combining those individual pure sine waves to create a harmonic spectrum that we create the other kinds of waveforms, such as square waves and sawtooth waves. The sine wave looks like this. The sound of a sine wave is absolutely pure and flute-like. The sine wave is also important because, as the basic building block of sound, it plays a crucial role in the creation of FM sounds, something we'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the series. All of these 5 waveforms sound different from one another. But not only do these different waveforms offer a variety of different sounding source material to choose from, but each of them has a totally different function when used as modulators in the LFO. We use the word modulate to describe what happens when one waveform is applied to another waveform to affect its sound. When these 5 waveforms are used as modulators in the LFO, they help create effects such as tremolo and vibrato. For example, listen to the effect a triangle wave has on a sound when it's used in the LFO to modulate pitch. Okay, now listen to how a square wave sounds doing the same thing. As you can see, different waveforms have different modulating characteristics. Here's how a square wave modulates pitch. A sawtooth wave going down. A sawtooth wave going up. And a triangle wave. Different waveforms have different characteristics, both as sound sources and as sound modulators. Become familiar with them because you'll find them popping up all over the place. Anyway, that's them, the 5 most common waveforms. So, where are we? We've talked about vibrations. We've talked about the 3 elements of sound, pitch, timbre, and volume. And we've talked about the 5 most common waveforms. Now I'm going to introduce the 7 components of a synthesizer. Once we've discussed these 7 components, you'll know enough about synthesis to actually begin making some of your own sounds. Here goes. The 7 components of a synthesizer are the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. Now, before we start, I have to say one thing. Some of you wise guys out there might be sitting home saying, well, wait a minute, I have an FM synthesizer or a Casio C or something like that or the other, and I don't have a filter or a filter envelope, so what's he talking about? Even if you don't have a component that is labeled filter envelope on your synthesizer, the fact of the matter is every synthesizer in existence has some means by which it allows you to change and manipulate the harmonic content and the harmonic envelope of a sound. Remember we talked about harmonics? Good. The point is, even if your synthesizer doesn't contain the word filter anywhere in its panel, it still has the equivalent of a filter, whether it's called a modulator or something else. As I explain the 7 main components of a synthesizer, I'll be giving examples of how each of these 7 main components is represented on some of today's most popular synthesizers. The point is, the principles I'm explaining to you relate to all brands of synthesizers: digital, analog, hybrid, or hyper-cross translateral. Trust me on this one. Okay. In very general terms, here's what these 7 components do. The amplifier, also known as the VCA or DCA. The amplifier controls the volume of a sound. It makes things louder and softer. Remember we talked about the volume envelope, the overall shape of the sound. Well, it's the job of the amplifier, along with the instructions it gets from the volume envelope, to make the sound louder and then softer. I'll demonstrate all this when we get to the volume envelope. So the amplifier controls volume. Next, the oscillator, also known as the OSC, the VCO, or the DCO. The oscillator controls the frequency of a sound. Remember we talked about pitch and how in musical terms frequency equals pitch? Well, the oscillator controls the pitch of a sound. If we want to make a high-pitched piccolo sound, we reach for the oscillator and do this. If we want to make a low-pitched bass sound, we reach for the oscillator and do this. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm demonstrating some of these parameters on what appears to be an ancient analog synthesizer. Well, the reason is because it's got knobs and faders. And it enables us to, first of all, program sounds a lot more quickly than the modern digital keyboards, and also have an opportunity to see what's happening to the parameter as we change it. The point to keep in mind is that this seemingly ancient synthesizer still addresses sound in the same exact way that the modern digital keyboards do. The same principles of sound apply. To demonstrate that, let me show you how I can change frequency exactly the same way on a newer keyboard. There are other ways of controlling the oscillator and therefore altering the pitch of a sound. One way is by using the LFO. We'll get to that in a minute. For now, just remember the oscillator controls pitch. The filter, also known as the VCF or DCF or any number of strange pseudonyms, the filter controls the harmonic content of a sound. In other words, it controls a sound's timbre. Remember timbre, don't you? In very general terms, what this means is that it is responsible for making a sound brighter or darker. You could even think of it as a sort of tone control, like the one in your stereo. Turn it one way and the sound gets brighter. Turn it the other way and the sound gets darker. What the filter is actually doing is increasing or decreasing the amount of upper harmonics that are present in the sound. If you open the filter, you allow the upper harmonics to be heard and the sound will sound brighter. As you close the filter, you filter out those upper harmonics and the sound becomes duller and darker. The filter controls the overall brightness of a sound. Remember, if you have a Yamaha DX or TX synth that generates sound using FM, don't worry that you don't have a filter. The modulator serves the same purpose. It controls the harmonic content of a sound. It makes the sound brighter or darker. More on this later. Anyway, as I just said, the point is that the filter controls the harmonic content or the timbre of the sound. Got it? Good. So is any of this starting to make sense? Do you see now why we started off talking about the 3 elements of sound? So I'd have a way of describing what these components actually do to a sound. Okay, let's continue. The amplifier controls volume, the oscillator controls pitch, the filter controls brightness. Next come the 3 envelope generators. the volume envelope, the filter envelope, and the pitch envelope. We've already talked a little bit about the volume envelope as it relates to the third element of sound, volume. Let's examine it a little more closely. The volume envelope is actually a group of settings that send instructions to the amplifier telling it when to get loud, how loud to get, and how fast it should take to get there. It's kind of like a dumb football player jock and his coach. Really, the amplifier is the dumb jock, and the envelope generator is the coach that tells him what to do. So, for example, when I press a key down with my finger, the envelope yells to the amplifier, "Hey, he pressed his finger down. Hurry up and start getting louder until you reach your peak volume." And the amplifier starts getting louder. And the envelope generator says, "Okay, you've reached your peak volume. Start getting softer until you reach your sustain level. And just stay at that level until I tell you what to do." And so the amplifier goes to the sustain level and stays there like a dummy, waiting for the envelope generator to tell it what to do. And finally, the envelope generator shouts to the amplifier, "Okay, he took his finger off the key, so go back to 0. Make sure you take 4 seconds to get there." So as you can see, the amplifier in tandem with one of the 3 envelope generators creates the volume envelope for a sound. The envelope generator is generating instructions about rates and levels. In other words, how fast to get loud, how loud to get. These instructions are responsible for giving a sound a dynamic shape. Without them, the sound would just sit there like a lump. Envelopes create motion over time. They change things automatically. The original envelopes had only 3 or 4 stages. They were called ADSR, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Nowadays, we have envelopes with as many as 8 or 16 stages, each with its own rate and level. We'll talk about them in more detail in part 2. The point is, even though today's envelopes are a little more flexible, they still serve the same function as the original ADSRs. They give a shape to the sound. There are 2 other envelopes to discuss, and they are the filter envelope and the pitch envelope. Both of these envelopes are identical in function to the volume envelope. The only difference has to do with what other component they're affecting. The volume envelope created a shape for the sound's volume by sending instructions to the amplifier. In the same way, the filter envelope creates a shape for the sound's brightness by sending instructions to the filter. Listen to this brass sound. Not only does the sound have an overall volume envelope shape, but if you listen to the brassy blat at the beginning of the note, you can hear that the sound also has a separate shape for the brightness of the sound. This is called a brightness envelope or a harmonic envelope, or to use the more commonly used term, a filter envelope. It's as if the filter envelope has been superimposed on top of the volume envelope. At times, it can be hard to tell them apart, but they are distinct, and you can learn to distinguish between the 2. By having both of them, you add one more dimension to the motion of your sound, one more tool for making your sound more interesting. Next, there's the pitch envelope. Same deal. The volume envelope in tandem with the amplifier affects loudness. The filter envelope in tandem with the filter affects brightness. Well, the pitch envelope in tandem with the oscillator affects, you guessed it, pitch. Listen to this sound. What's happening is the envelope generator in the pitch envelope is sending instructions to the oscillator. Remember the oscillator? It controls pitch. Just like all other envelopes, it's sending rate and level instructions about when, how fast, and how much. The only difference is that instead of those instructions controlling loudness or brightness, they're controlling pitch. Still, as envelopes do, it is changing one of the elements of a sound dynamically over time. Hey, wait a minute. Did I just say element of sound? 3 elements of sound. 3 envelope generators. Volume, timbre, pitch. Hey! As you can see, these 3 envelope generators correspond exactly to the very 3 elements of sound we spoke about at the beginning of the tape. So is this starting to come together for you? The point is that for every aspect of sound that we can hear and describe and analyze, there is a corresponding component on your synthesizer. that will address that element of sound. Okay? All right, one more component, and then you and I both need to take a walk to the all-night deli for some frozen pizza. So, what's left? We've covered the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the 3 envelope generators, volume, filter, and pitch. And last but by no means least is the good old LFO, not to be confused with the PLO or the BYO or the LMO. The LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. Interestingly enough, the LFO is exactly the same as the main oscillator, except for one important characteristic. It oscillates, that is, it vibrates at a low frequency. How low? Usually lower than 20 times a second. In other words, lower than our audible frequency range. That's why it's called the low frequency oscillator. So, why generate a frequency that only elephants and pigeons can hear? Well, the reason is because it's not actually routed to the audio path of the synthesizer. We don't hear it directly, but we do hear it indirectly. You see, the LFO is not used as a sound source. It's used as a modulator. We hear its effect on various other components. What kind of effects am I talking about? Well, if you route the LFO to the oscillator, you are modulating the pitch of a sound. Another word for pitch modulation is vibrato, to the frequency of the oscillators. If you route the LFO to the amplifier, you are modulating the amplitude or volume of the sound. And another word for amplitude modulation is tremolo. If you route the LFO to the filter, you're modulating the harmonic content of the sound. And, well, there is no other word for filter modulation. It's just called filter modulation. To the filter. In some sense, you can even route the LFO so that it controls the width of the pulse wave. This is called pulse width modulation, and it sounds like this. To the pulse width of A and B. In very simple terms, the LFO makes things wiggle. And variables such as how fast a sound wiggles or how much a sound wiggles are all controlled by settings within the LFO section of your synthesizer. Okay. So before we wrap this up, let's try making a sound from scratch and see if we can somehow tie together all these miscellaneous components. Let's start with a simple string sound. All right, campers, let's try and put all this stuff together. Let's try making a simple string sound by using the main components that we've already talked about. Let's start in the oscillator section and select the waveform. We can select any one of these three or all three, or any combination thereof. And we have a dual oscillator system, so we can combine in varying amounts to suit our needs. We can always go back later and adjust it, but for now, let's select a combination of waveforms that has a certain amount of brightness to it. Remember, you can always filter out too much brightness. Let's introduce the second oscillator. And now let's detune the two oscillators to get a little chorusing. See how easily simply adjusting the fine tuning or detuning these two oscillators can turn this flat sound into a lush sound. We could, at any point along the way, adjust the pulse width of this pulse wave. And adjust the relative balance of the two oscillators. design a string-like volume envelope. We're going to want a slow attack. And a slow release. All right, well, that's sending us in the right direction. That is a string-like volume envelope. And our textures are appropriate for our needs. Let's try designing a filter envelope that will address an important characteristic of a string sound. The attack of a string sound, which contains a rosin effect. We'll do that by adding a small amount of brightness in the very beginning of the filter envelope. First, let's lower the sustain level. In order to exaggerate the beginning. You can hear how simply by adding a little bit of attack, I've created a brightness shape in the very beginning of this string envelope. With some adjustment, this can successfully emulate the characteristics of a real string. Slight adjustments can be made by changing the cutoff point of the filter. And by adjusting the envelope amount. Let me just... Although it may seem subtle, here's an example where we have designed a filter envelope superimposed on top of the volume envelope to help give shape to the overall sound. Let's do one more thing, and that is add LFO into the string sound to emulate the kind of natural vibrato that a human string player would impart. I can choose to send the LFO modulation to any of three destinations: to the frequency of A and B, that is to control the pitch of the oscillator; to the pulse width of A and B, that is to control the width of the pulse wave of both oscillators; or to the filter. Let's see what happens if we modulate the pulse width, seeing as I am employing two pulse waves, one in each of the oscillators. I've routed the LFO to the pulse width, and now let me increase the amount of the LFO to hear what its effect will be. As you can hear, the pulse width modulation imparts a very subtle modulation into the sound that is similar to the vibrato we're looking for. This is not vibrato per se because we're not modulating pitch. We're modulating the width of the pulse wave. And there we have it, folks. A simple string sound. As you can begin to see, I was able to make this sound by applying the very principles we've discussed, the 5 most common waveforms and the 7 main components. Let's just review my steps. First, I selected waveforms in the oscillator section. I chose from among sawtooth waves, triangle waves, and pulse waves. Remember, the pulse wave, when its duty cycle is at 50%, is a square wave. Then, by controlling the pitch of one of the 2 oscillators, I was able to achieve a chorusing effect to fatten up the sound. Remember, the oscillator controls pitch. Next, I designed a volume envelope to create an overall shape for my sound. Remember, the envelope generator in tandem with the amplifier creates the volume envelope. Then, I designed a filter envelope to create a particular brightness shape for the rosiny bow-like effect. Next, I modified it slightly using the filter. Finally, I went to the LFO, the low-frequency oscillator, and using a triangle wave as a modulator, I modulated the pulse wave in the oscillator section. This is just one example of how to employ some of these waveforms and components to make sounds. The newer hybrid synths, like the Ensoniq SQ80, the Roland D50, the Korg M1, offer variations on these methods, but the basic principles are still the same. All synths have an oscillator section that lets you alter pitch. All synths have a volume envelope. All synths have some kind of a filter or method for altering harmonic content. And all synths have some kind of an LFO. They may call them by a different name. They may implement them slightly differently. But essentially, these 7 main components are the same regardless of make or model number. An oscillator is an oscillator, a volume envelope is a volume envelope, and an LFO is an LFO. And those 7 main components are what this series is all about. And that's it for part 1. Sure, we still have to examine those 7 main components in greater detail and talk about how they interact with each other. And yes, there are a number of other parameters and effects, such as noise, sync, chorusing, keyboard follow, which we haven't talked about. But those 7 components I've just described to you are the real meat of the matter. Once you have a thorough understanding of what they are and how to manipulate them, you'll be well on your way to becoming an accomplished synthesist in your own right. So, any questions, just drop a line to the New York School of Synthesis, Post Office Box 878, Ansonia Station, New York, New York, 10023. Please enclose a self-addressed stamp envelope for reply, only because we're cheap and we want to save on postage. Well, see you all next time. All right, where's the pizza? Sonic Explorers. Dean Friedman here, director of the New York School of Synthesis. I'm glad you could join us as we continue our investigation into the myriad wonders of synthesis. Right, for the next hour, we are going to examine in further detail the 7 main components of your typical synthesizer. But first, allow me to address an important issue. Is there really such a thing as a typical synthesizer? No, there is not. There are analog synths, digital synths, hybrid synths, FM synths, LA synths, IA synths, and additive synths, and recently we witnessed a virtual explosion of new generation of samplers. Is a sampler a synthesizer? Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. For our purposes, let's call it a special kind of a synthesizer. The point is there are enough similarities between these different kinds of synths to enable us to make some accurate statements about all of them as a group. All synths have some kind of volume envelope. Doesn't matter whether it's a Yamaha DX11 or a Korg M1 or a Roland Juno 2. All synths offer some means for changing the overall shape of a sound. All synths have some sort of LFO. In other words, all synths offer some means by which you can add vibrato or tremolo to a sound. These are synthesizer components that are common to all synthesizers. Once you understand these basic components, you'll then be able to sit down on any kind of synthesizer, regardless of its make or model number, and be able to start programming sounds. But before we get started talking about the similarities between all these synths, namely the 7 main components, let me take a minute to talk about some of the differences. Because a lot of people are confused about the variety of synthesizers out there and the different ways they have of generating sound. So, let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of synthesis. All right, here goes. In the beginning, there were analog synths. This was before the advent of the microprocessor. These days, we refer to any electronic device that evolved before the advent of computer technology as an analog device. In the world of synthesizers, this meant that the raw electrical vibrations generated in the synthesizer circuits traveled directly to the speakers in their original form, where they were then converted into the sound. These were analog synths. When the microprocessor-based synths came along, things changed a little bit. Instead of the sound being generated inside the synth using raw electrical vibrations, the sound was generated digitally, using strings of numbers and complex mathematical formulas called algorithms. So it's like this. Analog or digital refers to how the sound was originally generated. If it's generated by an old-fashioned raw current vibrating oscillator, it's considered analog. If it's generated by a number-crunching digital microprocessor, it's considered digital. But here's the kicker. The fact is that all so-called analog synths today use some kind of microprocessor to manipulate data, even if it's only for storing patches. And even on so-called digital synths, in order to hear those complex number-generated sounds, it's necessary to first convert them to analog form in order for us to hear it coming out of the speaker. So you see, all analog synths employ some digital technology, and all digital synths employ some analog technology. Got that? The truth is, the difference between analog and digital synths is becoming more and more impossible to discern. In some ways, it's simply a question of how an instrument sounds. For our purposes, let's just say that the difference between an analog and a digital synth is in how the sound is originally generated. Synthesizers like the Oberheim Matrix 12 and the Roland Super Jupiter are considered analog. Synths like the Yamaha DX7 and the Ensoniq SQ80 are considered digital. Okay, we've taken care of analog and digital. Let's talk about additive and subtractive. The very earliest experimental synths in sound labs and at universities employed additive synthesis. In additive synthesis, you make sounds by adding together individual sine waves, one on top of the other, until you create your own harmonic spectrum. Additive synthesis is very precise because essentially you're dialing up your own harmonics. But it was also, in the beginning, very cumbersome and expensive because you needed a separate oscillator for each and every harmonic in each and every note. Some sounds might have as many as 24 harmonics, and in those very early synths, you'd wind up with literally a room full of oscillators. So for that reason, when the first commercial synths came out, they abandoned additive synthesis in favor of what's known as subtractive synthesis. In subtractive synthesis, instead of needing a separate oscillator for each and every harmonic, you start out by generating a single waveform rich in harmonics, and then using a filter, you remove or subtract the unwanted portions of the waveform. Having a single filter and oscillator was obviously cheaper and took up less space than additive synthesis, so additive synthesizers took a backseat for a while to the subtractive synthesis model. The early analog synths like the Mini-Moog and the ARPs were subtractive synths. They started out by generating a waveform rich in harmonics, and then using a filter they filtered out or subtracted the unwanted portions of the sound. It's like that classic joke, how do you sculpt an elephant out of a block of wood? Well, the answer is easy. You just take a block of wood and chip away everything that doesn't look like an elephant. Whatever's left will look like an elephant. That's subtractive synthesis. You start with a rich waveform and you subtract the unwanted harmonics. That's how things remained for 15 to 20 years until one day in the early 70s, a guy named John Chowning was fooling around with two sine waves. He was experimenting with modulation. Instead of adding the two sine waves together as in additive synthesis, he was, in a sense, multiplying them together, applying one to the other, modulating the frequency of one with the frequency of the other. This process is known as frequency modulation, or FM, and serves as the basis for the entire DX and TX line of Yamaha, and now several other kinds of synthesizers. What happens in frequency modulation is that by modulating one sine wave with another, you wind up generating a very complex waveform which is extremely rich in harmonics. Getting a complex waveform for the price of only two sine waves was considered a pretty good deal, so Yamaha bought the rights to it and started putting it into their synthesizers. Up until then, Yamaha was only famous for making motorcycles. Casio applied a similar method of generating sound on their CZ series, which they call phase distortion. Phase distortion is related to FM in that it employs a kind of modulation to generate complex waveforms. And then came the samplers. Once samplers came along, it changed the whole ballgame drastically. Samplers make digital recordings of real sounds and then let you play back from a keyboard. The thing about a sampler is that it has no real sound of its own. You can't build a sound from scratch on a sampler. It has whatever sampled sound you happen to load into it at the time. It can be a flute or a piano or a violin or a breaking glass. Even so, samplers obey most of the main rules of synthesis, which is why I still consider them to be a subcategory of synthesizers. They still have a volume envelope. They still have some kind of LFO. Most of them have some kind of filter. So we have analog and digital, additive, subtractive, FM, phase distortion, and samplers. The point is, as synthesizers continue to evolve, we see more and more systems that actually use more than one kind of synthesis to generate sound. These newer systems become more difficult to define, so let's just call them hybrids. One of these hybrids is a group of synths that use complex digitally stored wavetables, kind of samples, as source material instead of just the simple square wave and triangle waveforms we're familiar with. Synths like the Korg DW6000 introduced this analog-digital hybrid. Since then, even the hybrids have evolved. Synths like the Korg M1, the Ensoniq SQ80, and the Roland D50 allow you to mix digital samples of real acoustic sounds with digital versions of traditional analog synth waveforms, such as square wave and triangle waves. You can then use an analog-type filter, a tool of subtractive synthesis, to alter the sound. Roland calls their hybrid version LA synthesis. The letters are supposed to stand for linear algorithmic synthesis, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, coincidentally, they're also the initials of a densely populated, smog-ridden city on the West Coast known for its designer pizza. These synths, which employ digital samples, or PCMs, as part of their source material, combine some of the best features of both samplers and synthesizers in a single box. So have you got all of this straight in your head? There are analog synths, there are FM synths, there are additive synths, there are samplers, and now we have hybrids, which are part sampler and part traditional synthesizer. Boy, oh boy, how do you tell which is which? It doesn't matter. Regardless of how they do it, they all have to address the same three elements of sound. They all offer some way of altering pitch, some way of manipulating timbre, and some way of controlling volume over time. So now that you have some idea about the different kinds of synths that are out there, let's start figuring out how to make sounds on them. To briefly review what we've covered in Part 1, the 7 main components are the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. And here's a quick explanation of their functions. The amplifier controls loudness. The oscillator controls pitch. The filter controls brightness or timbre. The volume envelope is the first of 3 envelope generators that, together with the amplifier, creates the overall shape of a sound over time. The filter envelope is the second of the 3 envelope generators that, together with the filter, creates the shape of a sound's harmonic content over time. The pitch envelope is the third of the 3 envelope generators that, along with the oscillator, controls the shape of a sound's pitch over time. And the LFO wiggles the sound. In other words, it adds some kind of modulation to a sound, such as vibrato or tremolo. The particular type of modulation depends on which other component is being modulated. For example, if you modulate the oscillator, you get vibrato. If you modulate the amplifier, you get tremolo. Okay, so let's start again from the beginning and examine each of these 7 main components in greater detail. The amplifier controls loudness or volume, also sometimes referred to as level. Some synths allow you to set a balance between the levels of 2 or more parts of a single voice. This is the panel of the Ensoniq SQ80, a digital crosswave synthesizer. And if we look at the lower part of the split screen, surprise, surprise, we have very familiar synthesizer components. We have the OSC, the oscillators. We have DCA, which are the amplifiers. We have a filter. We have envelopes. And we have LFOs. All of these comprise the 7 main components we've been talking about all along. On the Ensoniq SQ80, the level parameter in the amplifier section allows you to adjust the relative amplitude or volume level between the 3 oscillators. Let's see how we can adjust the relative level of the amplifier between the click sound in oscillator 1 and the sawtooth wave in oscillator 2. First, let's introduce a maximum level for the click. Now let's go to the DCA for oscillator 2 and introduce a level for the sawtooth wave. This is an example of how we use the amplifier to control the relative level amounts or volume amounts between 2 oscillators. This is the panel of the Roland D50, another hybrid synth which, like the Ensoniq SQ80, offers you the ability to combine PCM samples along with digital versions of traditional analog waveforms. As on the SQ80, setting the relative volume amounts between the different oscillators that make up a single voice is a job for the amplifier. This is usually referred to as balance. Remember, although the term amplifier is not being displayed, the setting of relative amplitude or volume amounts is an amplifier function. Whereas the Ensoniq SQ80 has 3 oscillators per voice, the Roland D50 offers you 4 oscillators per voice, or what they refer to as partials. By moving the D50's joystick from side to side, I am able to adjust the relative balance between two of the four partials or oscillators. Partial number 2 is dedicated to an analog waveform. And if I change the balance, you can hear that analog waveform introduced, along with the digital sample of the attack of a real harp sound. Here's the real harp. Here's the real harp with the analog waveform. Those are some of the amplifier volume parameters that can be set directly. Others are set indirectly. For example, when you apply modulation from the LFO to the amplifier, you don't set it at the amplifier. You normally do that from the LFO section. Similarly, when you create a volume envelope, you are in fact controlling the amplifier, but the adjustments that you make are in the volume envelope section. Remember, even if you don't see the word amplifier laid out neatly on your synthesizer panel, believe me, somewhere in your synthesizer is a component or parameter that allows you to control the volume or amplitude of your sound. Next comes the oscillator, often labeled VCO, DCO, OSC, or frequency. The oscillator controls pitch. This is a component that comes in many different forms and disguises. But remember, whatever you call it, it controls the frequency or the pitch of a sound. Let's look at a few of them. Here's the oscillator page on the Ensoniq SQ80. Let's examine the kinds of parameters we can find in the typical oscillator section. Over here we see the wave select. And as we cycle through these stored digital waveforms, we'll see, again, familiar looking waveforms. The square wave, a pulse wave, a sawtooth wave, and a sine wave. The very waves that we talked about in the beginning of the series. In addition to those analog-like waveforms, there are a variety of digitally sampled waveforms, all of which can be selected as source material for a sound. Some of the other parameters found in the oscillator section are your octave switch or range switch, which changes the pitch of the oscillator by an octave, the semitone parameter, which changes the pitch of the oscillator by half step, and the fine-tuning control. These are typical oscillator parameters. All of these functions somehow affect the pitch. The SQ80 allows us to combine up to 3 oscillators simultaneously in a single sound. If we turn on the second oscillator in the DCA section, that is the amplifier section, by engaging the output parameter, turning it on, we hear both oscillators at once. If we examine oscillator number 2, we'll see the waveform is a brass wave. Let's see what happens when we detune these 2 oscillators by changing the fine-tuning of oscillator 2 relative to oscillator 1. By slightly altering the tuning, we achieve a chorusing effect. This This is the front panel of the Korg M1. The Korg M1 is another hybrid, like the Ensoniq SQ80 and the Roland D50. It offers a variety of digital sampled waveforms along with digital versions of traditional analog waveforms, and allows you to modify them in traditional analog terms. The M1 is a dual oscillator system, and as you can see, it contains familiar oscillator parameters. This is the oscillator page, and this parameter, the octave parameter, allows us to set the range of the oscillator. The overall octave. If we go to the oscillator 2 page, not only can we change the range as well as the amplitude level, we can change the interval between the oscillators. We can also detune these two oscillators to achieve a chorusing effect. This is the front panel of the Roland D50, another PCM-based hybrid. The Roland D50 is a 4-oscillator system. Roland refers to each of these 4 oscillators as partials, and they let you select waveforms and control pitch, just like every other oscillator. So let's take a look at them. Except this time, instead of observing these oscillator functions on the D50's own graphic display, let's make use of an extremely helpful computer program called D50 Master by SoundQuest. This is what's known as voice editing software. It displays all the internal voice parameters of the D50 on a computer screen in such a way that you can easily see the entire voice architecture of a sound in a single glance. It is much easier than having to punch up parameter after parameter on the D50's own small graphic display. For example, in partial 2, we can alter the pitch by clicking in on the pitch parameter and moving the mouse back and forth. We can also alter the fine-tuning of the pitch. We can also select different waveforms, the triangle wave or a pulse wave. And, as is generally the case when a pulse wave is offered on a synthesizer, they provide the means for you to manipulate the width of that pulse wave. This parameter allows us to alter the width, or the duty cycle, of the pulse wave. Listen how the timbre changes as the width of the pulse wave changes. This is the detune section of this Casio CZ, and it allows us to detune the dual oscillator system by intervals of an octave, by notes, intervals, or by fine-tuning. This is a handy way of adding chorusing to the sound. Chorusing, or detuning, is an excellent way to turn an otherwise boring sound into an interesting and usable one. It's simple to do and it's very effective. In fact, the effect is so useful and common that many synths today offer a separate chorus button, which when pressed automatically detunes the oscillators of a sound slightly apart to achieve the desired chorusing effect. The advantage to being able to combine multiple sound sources to create a single voice is obvious. You can create a harmonically rich and interesting composite sound to use as your source material. And that's before you even start manipulating it with filters and envelopes and the like. Making intelligent choices early on while selecting source material in the oscillator section is an important first step in designing sounds. The right choice at this stage will take you that much further towards your sound goal. Okay, now comes the fun part. I've got to explain all about filters. But half of you own synths like Yamaha DXs and Casio CZs that don't actually have a filter on them. So bear with me, because here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to show you the parameters of your typical filter. Parameters like the filter cutoff point and resonance. And then I'll talk about some of the components on other kinds of synths that serve approximately the same function as a filter. Components such as the modulators on the DX series. Okay, here goes. The filter, also known as the VCF, controls the harmonic content of a sound. Its overall brightness. Here's the filter section of the Prophet 600, an analog synth. The main control in any filter section is the cutoff control, which is where you determine the point at which the filter will begin cutting off the harmonics within the sound. This represents the working edge of the filter. This is the filter page in the Core Gam 1. Notice it's labeled VDF, Variable Digital Filter, although I like to think of it as a very digital filter. The point is whatever they call it, it's a filter. And just like the filter on the original analog synths, it's got a cutoff point. When you open the filter, the sound gets brighter. As you close the filter, the sound gets duller. Brighter, duller. Let's examine the filter on the SQ80. As you see from the panel, there are familiar filter parameters. We can control the frequency or the filter cutoff point of the filter. As we open the filter, the sound gets brighter. As we close the filter, the sound gets duller. Here's the filter control in the D50, the cutoff frequency control for this partial. Watch what happens to the filter as I change the filter's cutoff frequency. Brighter or darker? The next most important parameter in the filter section is called resonance. Resonance acts to exaggerate the harmonic frequencies that occur right at the filter cutoff point. The effect of this is that resonance can add a particular kind of rushing energy to a sound, a sort of controlled feedback. Resonance. You can hear how the resonance will exaggerate the harmonics at the filter cutoff point. It's more evident when I actually move the filter cutoff point. It's even more obvious when I design a filter envelope that makes the cutoff point move over time. That wah-wah effect is a result of resonance. Here's an example of resonance on the filter page of the Ensoniq SQ80. Select the value for resonance. And you can hear the resonance, that is, the exaggerated harmonics around the filter cutoff point. Resonance on the D50. Listen to what happens to the sound as I increase the resonance. One last parameter that is typically located in the filter section of a synthesizer is known as envelope amount. Envelope amount controls the degree to which the filter envelope affects a sound. the Korg M1, the envelope amount parameter is referred to as EG intensity, envelope generator intensity. They call it by a different name, but it performs the same function. It determines the degree to which the filter envelope will affect the cutoff point of the filter. Roland refers to the envelope amount parameter on their D50 as envelope depth. One of the fun games that I enjoy on those long, boring winter nights is to try and figure out how many different names synthesizer manufacturers have come up with to describe the same exact parameters. Envelope amount, envelope depth, envelope intensity. Different names for the same parameter. Okay, so that's the traditional filter model. So what about you poor FM synthesis guys? How does this apply to you? Well, put simply, on an FM synthesizer, and that includes any of the Yamaha DX or TX series, or some of the new Korg synths, there is a component that is responsible for controlling the harmonic content of the sound. It's called the modulator. Now, a traditional filter changes harmonic content of a sound by removing or replacing the upper portions of the harmonic spectrum. This is referred to as subtractive synthesis, because the filter is subtracting the unwanted portions of the original harmonically rich waveform. Now, a modulator changes harmonic content by adding harmonics to a sound. It does this through a process called frequency modulation, FM. Actually, frequency modulation is more like multiplication. One waveform modulates another waveform, and you wind up with a very rich and complex waveform. In any case, the point of all this is that on an FM synth, it is the modulator that controls the harmonic content of a sound. Or to put it another way, it is the job of the modulator to control the timbre of a sound. So listen to what happens as you increase the level of a modulator. In order to increase the brightness in a sound. Okay, so it's not a filter, but don't you see, it does the same thing. It serves a similar purpose. They both address the same element of sound, timbre. Oh, and just in case you Casio owners out there thought I was going to abandon you to the vagaries of phase distortion, let me add, on Casio CZ synths, the parameter that is responsible for controlling timbre is called the DCW. In fact, the DCW on a CZ synth is very similar to the modulator on a DX synth. The point is, all of these components, the filter, the modulator, and the DCW, while they are not identical in as far as how they do what they do, they all do essentially the same thing. They alter a sound's timbre. So far, we've chosen and then slightly manipulated our source material in the oscillator section. Then we've gone ahead and altered the timbre of our sound in the filter section, or by adjusting the modulator or DCW. Now let's go and design an overall shape for our sound. After all, every sound deserves a shape. And if you've been paying any attention at all up until now, you'll know that that's a job for the volume envelope. We're going to look at a few different kinds of volume envelopes. Again, try and keep in mind that even though the structure of these volume envelopes may differ from machine to machine, they're essentially doing exactly the same thing. As I said earlier, my purpose in doing this is to familiarize you with the common parameters of a typical synth and their functions, in order that you may then be able to sit down at any synthesizer and know how to start programming it. So, a volume envelope is a volume envelope. It doesn't matter what machine it's on. Let's start with a familiar analog type ADSR envelope, just to get our feet wet. ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now, before we continue, I have to caution you. There is an invisible fifth stage in an ADSR envelope, and it's called peak. It's not written on your synthesizer panel. It's not mentioned in your manual, but it's there, and I'm telling you about it now. Peak is the maximum volume level of a sound, and it is located between attack and decay. All right? Now you know. And aren't you glad I told you? Oh, one other word of caution. Don't confuse piano terminology with synthesizer terminology, okay? In the world of acoustic pianos, remember acoustic pianos, don't you? They're made of wood. The word sustain has a specific meaning in regards to the sustain pedal, and it implies extending the tail end of a note so that it dies out gradually. On a synthesizer, the word sustain means something else entirely. Don't confuse the two. So, from the beginning, if you want to alter the beginning of a sound's shape, you change its attack. Increase the attack and the sound begins gradually. Decrease the attack and the sound begins suddenly. Attack is a rate control. It determines the speed that it takes the sound to go from 0 volume level to the next level, and that next level just happens to be peak. Peak is the point at which a sound reaches its maximum volume level. It is a fixed automatic setting. You can't change it. That's why it has no knob, but it's there. Every time you press a key, the volume of a note will go from 0 level to peak level at the speed of attack. Once a sound reaches its peak level, it continues immediately to the next volume level, and the next volume level is known as the sustain level. The stage between the peak level and the sustain level is called decay. Decay is a rate, and it determines the speed at which a sound's volume level travels from peak to sustain. Now, the sustain level is the volume level at which a note will stay for as long as you hold your finger down on the key. If you hold your finger on the key for 30 seconds, the note's volume will remain at the sustain level for 30 seconds. When you finally take your finger off the key, the volume level will finally return to 0 volume level at the rate of release. Envelopes take some getting used to, but let's just try and make some basic changes to this envelope to see what's involved in manipulating the ADSR, or any envelope generator. We have our attack, which we can slow down. Or speed up. And we have our release, which we can slow down or speed up. We can also remove the sustain level. Now listen, having removed the sustain, what we're left with is the peak portion of the envelope. What's happening is the envelope is cycling instantly to peak and back to 0 again, leaving us a click. We can lengthen that click by either slowing down the attack going to peak or slowing down decay going from peak back to 0. Let's slow down the attack and hear what happens. The envelope is going gradually from 0 to peak and then instantly back to 0. Or we could expand the click in the other direction to go from peak to sustain by increasing the amount of decay. At this point, the envelope goes instantly to peak and then gradually from peak to the sustain level, which is 0. We can create a swell or a hump in the sound by slowing down the attack and the decay. So in a sense, the envelope is going gradually up to peak and gradually back down. So anyway, to sum up, we press a key and the note travels from 0 to peak at the rate of attack. Then it travels from peak to sustain at the rate of decay. And then, usually it travels from sustain back to 0 again at the rate of release. Got that? It's simple enough. 4 levels and 3 rates. Huh? Did I say 4 levels and 3 rates? What is he talking about? I thought these were ADSRs, and now he's talking about rates and levels just like on the Yamaha Casio envelopes. What gives? Just what I said. Peak and sustain are levels, and so is 0. In fact, there are 2 0 levels, the initial 0 level and the final 0 level. 3 of them, initial 0, peak, and final 0, are fixed levels, but they're levels just the same. Sustain is the only variable level. And attack, decay, and release are 3 rates. They determine the speed it takes to get from one level to the next. So, ADSRs are really not all that different than the newer 4 and 8 stage envelopes. Let's look at one and see how they're the same and how they're not. This is the EG, or envelope generator section of the DX7. It consists of rates and levels. 4 rates and 4 levels. Let's see what happens when we slow down rate number 1. Remember, rate number 1 would be analogous to what we know of as the attack portion of a volume envelope. Let's slow down rate number 4. Rate number 4 would be analogous to the release portion of an ADSR envelope. This is the volume envelope on the Korg M1. They've chosen to label it VDA1EG, which stands for something like Variable Digital Amplifier 1 Envelope Generator. Whatever they chose to call it, it's a volume envelope. And it has familiar stages. It has attack time, attack level, decay time, what they refer to as breakpoint, a slope time, and sustain level. Breakpoint is simply a level that falls between the first attack level and the sustain level. They've chosen to give it a name called breakpoint, and the rate between breakpoint and sustain, they've chosen to give a name called slope time. Whatever they call these parameters, these stages of the envelope, they still are rates and levels. And in this case, we have 4 rates and 3 levels. The 4th level is assumed because it's the last level, which is going back to 0. So let's hear what happens to the sound if we slow down the attack. And if we add a little release, we select the release parameter. The same rules of volume envelopes apply, regardless of what the stages are named. We're dealing with rates and levels. The level of the volume is going from 0 to one level, to another level, to another level, and finally back to 0. In the architecture on the SQ80, envelope number 4 determines the overall volume envelope for the sound. As you can see from the display on top, there are 3 levels, level 1, 2, and 3, and 4 rates, or times. Let's confirm that this is the overall volume envelope by changing the rate of the attack, that is, the first time parameter. Fast, slow, fast, slow. Let's take a look at the volume envelope of the D50. We click in on the volume envelope icon in parcel number 2. That's the square here. And the volume envelope is displayed, both numerically in times and levels, as well as graphically. See how easy it is to change the shape of the envelope simply by clicking and dragging onto the graphic envelope display. If we want to slow down the attack, we simply reshape the envelope. The same is true of the release portion of the envelope. Witness how easy it is to design a double attack in this volume envelope simply by dragging down level 2. So, now you know all about volume envelopes. They can have short attacks or long attacks, short releases or long releases, and sometimes they can have a bump or a hump or two in the middle. And now the filter envelope. Now the first thing to remember here is that the structure of all envelope generators is the same. The ADSR, or the rate level structure of a filter envelope, is exactly the same as that of a volume envelope. They are the same exact controls: attack, decay, sustain, release. Except instead of controlling the amplifier and loudness, as does the volume envelope, the ADSR of the filter envelope controls the filter or brightness. Of course, by now I hope you understand that when I say filter envelope, I'm including those systems that don't have filters, but that do control the harmonic spectrum of the sound. Perhaps a better generic term would be if instead of filter envelope, I said harmonic envelope or brightness envelope. In any case, they all imply the same thing. Just as the volume envelope controls the shape of a sound's volume over time, the filter envelope, or harmonic envelope, controls the shape of a sound's brightness over time. Now this is a simple concept to understand. Basically, what we're doing is superimposing one envelope over another. The filter envelope is being superimposed over the volume envelope. Here's a graphic display of the filter envelope on the Roland D50. Listen how easy it is to alter the filter envelope simply by clicking and dragging on the graphic display. This is the filter envelope, or the harmonic envelope, on the Korg M1. They call it the variable digital filter EG envelope generator. Listen to what happens as we slow down the attack rate of the filter envelope. Filter envelopes, or harmonic envelopes, can create a shape for the brightness within the overall shape of the volume envelope. They add even more dynamic internal motion to the sound. Remember, think of the filter envelope and the volume envelope as one envelope superimposed over the other. And so we come to the pitch envelope. The pitch envelope controls the direction of the sound's pitch. It does this by sending rate and level controls to the oscillator, which, as we know, controls pitch. With a pitch envelope, you can make a sound's pitch slide up, or you can make its pitch slide down, or you can make it slide up and down. The thing is, when you're dealing in the realm of pitch, it's easy to hear quite clearly the shape of the envelope and how it goes up and down. For the most part, the pitch envelope behaves exactly as do the other two envelopes. Here's a display of the pitch envelope on the Roland D50. 0 represents the center pitch, and a range of plus or minus 50 allows you to slide up to the pitch or down to the pitch. Here's the pitch envelope page on the Korg M1. Listen what happens if I set all my times, or rates, so that they travel slowly. The attack, decay, and release times. And I move from a high start level to a low attack level to a high release level. And that's the pitch envelope. It can slide up, or it can slide down, or it can slide up and down. It's useful for creating automatic pitch bends or for swooping special effects, or used more subtly for adding a touch of realism to the attack portion of some brass and woodwind instruments, or even the voice. Those kinds of subtleties are the sorts of things that help make a synthesized sound more convincing. And the pitch envelope can help you do it. So let's see where we are. We've talked about the amplifier and how it controls volume. We've gone over the oscillator and how it controls pitch. We've discussed the filter and how it controls timbre or brightness. We've even talked about those three amazing envelopes, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, and the pitch envelope, and how they each control a different aspect of sound by sending instructions to the amplifier, the filter, and the oscillator, respectively. So, what's left? Yes. The LFO, the low frequency oscillator. The LFO wiggles the sound. Yes, I said wiggle. A more mature and grown-up expression might be modulate. The LFO modulates a sound. That is, it imparts a continuously repeating vibration to some aspect of the sound, such as the volume, or the timbre, or the pitch. The effect of the LFO is contingent on which other component the LFO is being sent to. We call this routing. So, for example, if we route the LFO to modulate the amplifier, we achieve amplitude modulation. Another word for amplitude modulation is tremolo. If we route the LFO to modulate the oscillator, we get what's called frequency modulation. And another word for frequency modulation is vibrato. If we route the LFO to the filter, we get filter modulation. And there is no other word for filter modulation. We just call it filter modulation. Remember the pulse wave from the 5 most common waveforms? Well, it's even possible to route the LFO so that it controls the width of the pulse wave. Each of these techniques represents a way of imparting a different kind of internal motion to a sound. It helps make the sound more interesting, and it goes a long way towards making a synthesized sound less mechanical by emulating to some degree the way we humans tend to reproduce sounds. This page allows us to assign LFO to modulate the pitch. It's labeled pitch MG, or pitch modulation generator, and it has familiar settings for an LFO. It allows us to select different waveforms, to change the frequency, to add delay, intensity, or amount. Let's see what happens when we increase the amount. And let's see what happens when we select a different waveform. We can change the frequency or the rate. And we can add a certain amount of delay. This page on the Core Game 1 allows us to control the LFO to the filter. We can control the amount of the modulation, or the intensity. We can control the speed of the modulation. And we can control or select the waveform that does the modulating. Here's the LFO on a DX7 synthesizer. Again, we see familiar parameters. Let's see what happens if we increase the pitch modulation depth. Let's change the speed. let's change the waveform. Another parameter in the LFO section is LFO sync, which determines the direction in which the LFO modulating wave is traveling every time you trigger the key. When sync is off, the modulation begins in a different place every time you strike a key. When sync is on, every time you strike a key, the LFO will travel from the same exact point in the same direction. Here's the LFO page on the Ensoniq SQ80. As you can see, all the familiar values for LFO are on this page. We can select the LFO level, otherwise known as LFO amount or intensity. We can also select the frequency or the rate or speed of the LFO. Another familiar LFO parameter is wave select, where we can choose from among triangle waves, or sawtooth waves, square waves, or a random wave, or what's labeled here as a noise wave. So, you got that? The LFO wiggles the note. And that's it. Go make yourself a sardine sandwich, pop open a beer, and watch the ball game. You deserve it. Seriously. There are, of course, a variety of stray parameters such as noise, sync, cross-modulation, and keyboard tracking that tend to be instrument-specific. But if you understand the 7 main components that we've just gone over, you'll be able to make sounds. You see, when you're programming your own synthesized sounds, it's always useful to experiment and twiddle knobs and use your intuition. You can come up with some good sounds that way, just fooling around. That's fine. But to really get the most out of your instrument, you really need to know how to make a sound on purpose. That's why understanding these 7 main components and how they relate to the 3 elements of sound, pitch, timbre, and volume, can help you make intelligent choices when you're programming. On part 3 of this 3-part series, we'll concentrate on actually designing sounds or modifying existing sounds, applying the rules and principles we've covered in the first 2 tapes. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, just drop us a line at the New York School of Synthesis, P.O. Box 878, Ansonia Station, New York, New York, 10023. And if it's not too crazy around here, we'll try and answer you. Anyway, this is Dean Friedman for the New York School of Synthesis saying, happy programming, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of this Intro to Synthesis series. I'm going to assume that if you've gotten this far, you're already familiar with the 3 elements of sound, the 5 most common waveforms, and the 7 main components of a synthesizer. Also, I suspect by now that you've been sufficiently exposed to the messages that we've been subliminally bombarding you with during the first 2 tapes in this series, all part of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy of computer wiznoids whose secret hidden agenda involves global domination through the use of select audio frequency modulation. But let's not worry about any of that for the time being. Instead, what I'd like to do is explore a little further all of the principles that we've talked about in the first 2 tapes. We'll do that by making some sounds from scratch, as well as by modifying existing sounds, in order to see how the 7 main components actually work. We'll also try and talk about some of the miscellaneous features and components, aside from the big 7, that you're likely to run into on some synthesizers, but not others. Things like noise, sync, cross-modulation, etc. And finally, we'll spend a little time discussing performance controls. Those are controllers like the pitch bend wheel or the mod wheel. And it even includes such features as velocity, sensitivity, and aftertouch. So, let's continue our discussion of sound modifying parameters by talking about noise. Early synthesizers had a separate oscillator that generated random noise. That is, random frequencies that created the sound of shh or a wave or the winds that are associated with transient attacks on percussive instruments. Let me say that another way. Noise sounds like this. Or this. Today's newer hybrids, which consist of PCM samples or wave tables of different sounds, offer a separate sampled waveform of different kinds of noise that can be incorporated into your sound. Noise is used to create the breathy quality at the beginning of a flute sound, or to impart some distortion to electric guitar. Here is a noise sample on the Roland D50. This is the noise switch on a Casio CZ. Here's the sound without noise. Here's the sound with. As always, noise is a useful component for adding a breathy quality to a sound or creating transient attacks, as in snare drums or percussion sounds. This is the feedback parameter on the DX7. It's the DX7's equivalent of being able to introduce noise into a sound. If we increase the feedback level from 0 to 7, hear what happens to the sound. When making sounds using the 7 main components, there's sometimes the temptation to utilize everything but the kitchen sink. In fact, sometimes we even use the sink. Let's talk about sync. Sync is a parameter in which one oscillator controls the frequency of another oscillator, so that every time the first oscillator completes its first cycle and begins another cycle, it forces the second oscillator to begin its cycle as well, regardless of whether it's completed its cycle. The result is the second oscillator continually abbreviates the cycle of its waveform. The effect of this in the sound is that as you change the frequency of the oscillator being synced, you change not the pitch of the overall sound, but the harmonic content. For example, let's turn on the sync parameter and then change the frequency of oscillator 2 to hear how that affects the timbre in the sound. Even though I'm changing the pitch of oscillator 2, because it is being synced by oscillator 1, the overall sound has a change in timbre. what sync is doing is forcing oscillator 2 to sync up to oscillator 1. Just as resonance is more obvious when the filter cutoff point changes over time, the effect of sync becomes more obvious when the frequency of the oscillator being synced changes over time. Let's do that by controlling the frequency of oscillator 2 by one of the envelope generators. Here's oscillator 2. Now let's assign envelope number 1 to control it. We then select envelope number 1 and change its parameter to hear the effect changing the frequency of oscillator 1 has when sync is being engaged. Let's raise the level a little and slow down the rate that goes to that level and hear what happens to the sound. Just as the exaggerated harmonics at the filter cutoff point of resonance can be heard as the filter cutoff point changes over time, the exaggerated harmonic in the sync mode can be heard as the frequency of the oscillator being synced changes over time. Amplitude modulation is similar to frequency modulation, or what's sometimes called cross modulation, in which one oscillator is used to modulate another oscillator. Let's see what happens as I engage amplitude modulation, turning it on, and then change the octave range of one of the oscillators. This process is similar to FM in that it generates a variety of sidebands, making the waveform rich in harmonics. This is the glide parameter, also referred to as portamento, and in a variation as glissando. And it controls the speed with which an oscillator moves from one note to another. With glide at a setting of 0, the oscillator moves instantly from note to note. If we slow down the rate of glide, the oscillator takes longer to get from note to note. This is the portamento parameter on the D50, and by setting the rate of the portamento and engaging the portamento button, we can turn this sound into this sound. These three parameters control the portamento, the kinds of portamento, as well as the rate of portamento. The DX7 allows you to have a continuous portamento, or with the glissando parameter on, the portamento will be by step. This parameter allows you to set the time value for portamento. I just want to say something about performance, and it's this. How you perform a sound, in other words, the way you play it, has almost as much to do with making the sound convincing as does the sound itself. In other words, I might have this great electric guitar sound, but if I play it as if it were a honky-tonk piano, it wouldn't be convincing. However, if I play it while trying to retain some of the performance characteristics of the sound, it makes all the difference in the world. So let's look at some performance controls. This is the pitch bend wheel. It allows me to control the overall pitch of a sound in real time. That is, as I play the note. Being able to alter some aspect of a sound in real time is an important way of imparting life to a synthesized sound. It makes your performance more, well, for lack of a better word, human. It's the kind of thing that can help make your synthesizer more of an instrument. Let's look at some of these performance controls, or controllers, and see how they interact with the various synthesizer components we've already discussed. This first one, the pitch bend wheel, is obviously controlling the frequency of the oscillator. Remember, the oscillator controls pitch. Well, the only difference between this pitch bend wheel and the tuning control inside the synthesizer is that the tuning control is inside the synthesizer, and the pitch bend wheel is sitting in a handy location right near the keyboard. They both are doing the same exact thing. They control pitch. Most synthesizers today offer variable pitch bend. In other words, they let you determine the range of the pitch bend, anywhere from a minor second, a half step, to an octave. This parameter allows you to adjust the range of pitch bend on the DX7, up to an octave. The DX7 also allows you to enter a value for the step of the pitch bend. Next, let's take a look at the mod wheel. The mod wheel is similar to the pitch bend wheel, except instead of controlling the frequency of the oscillator, the mod wheel will normally control the amount of LFO. Let's talk about this a little. When we first looked at the LFO, we saw how once you set the assorted values for which waveform would do the modulating and what the rate of LFO would be, you could then adjust the depth or the amount of the LFO effect that would be in the sound. Well, there's another way of adding LFO to a sound. Instead of programming the LFO amount so that it's a permanent part of the sound from beginning to end, the mod wheel lets us introduce LFO into the sound whenever we want. The further we move the wheel, the more LFO we hear. You see, the mod wheel is exactly the same as the LFO amount parameter. The only difference is that it's sitting in a handy location to the left of the keyboard for easy instant access. It lets you introduce and change the amount of LFO in a sound in real time. Some synths allow you to route the mod wheel so that it controls other parameters of the sound, such as the filter or the amplifier. But the principle is still the same. It allows you to control the amount of something in real time, whether it's the amount of LFO, vibrato, or the amount of brightness. Different synths have different versions of performance controls. The Korg M1 has a joystick instead of a pitch wheel and a separate mod wheel. The joystick does the job of the pitch wheel and the mod wheel by assigning both functions to different points on an XY axis. Pitch bend goes left to right. Pitch modulation goes up. And filter modulation goes down. Let's see what happens when we change the amount of pitch bend. Right now, it's a whole step, or 2 semitones. Here's a 3-way pitch bend mod wheel controller, typical of Roland instruments, which allows you to control pitch bend left to right, as well as modulation, pressing it forward. The point is, they all function in basically the same way. They let you reach inside your sound and change some aspect of it in real time. Two other useful kinds of performance controls are velocity sensitivity and aftertouch. They may not seem like performance controls because they're built right into your keyboard, but they are. Just like the mod wheel and the pitch bend wheel, they let you control some aspect of a sound in real time according to how you play the keys. The first one, velocity sensitivity, generally lets you control the volume of a sound according to how quickly you strike the key. In some sense, velocity sensitivity can control other parameters, such as the speed of the attack or the amount of brightness. Let's take a look at velocity sensitivity on the Korg M1. This page has to do with velocity sensitivity and its control of the amplifier and the volume envelope parameters. We can control overall amplitude, the overall speed of the volume envelope, the attack rate, the decay rate, the slope rate, and the release rate. Let's hear what happens when we control the overall amplitude of a sound using velocity sensitivity. This is its most common application. When this value is at 0, how I play has no effect on the volume or amplitude of the sound. Quickly or slowly. The level or amplitude of the sound remains the same. If, however, I increase the value of amplitude sensitivity, how I play the note will determine the level of the note. If I play it quickly, the level will be louder than if I play it softly. Velocity sensitivity control of the amplitude. This page allows us to set velocity sensitivity according to different parts of the filter and filter envelope. We can set it for the envelope intensity, or the amount. We can set it for the envelope time, which will control the rate of the envelope according to how quickly or slowly you play. We can set it for the speed of attack, for the decay, and for the slope time, as well as the release time. Let's hear what happens if we set the velocity sensitivity to control the intensity of the envelope generator. When the value for this parameter is set at 0, it doesn't matter whether I play quickly or slowly. The envelope amount for the filter is still the same. However, if I set the value at 99, how I play the note will change the amount of the filter envelope. In the Ensoniq SQ80, the parameter LV in the envelope section stands for velocity control of the level velocity. When this parameter is engaged, how you strike the key will determine the level of whatever parameter the envelope is controlling. So for example, if we set this parameter in envelope 4, which on this instrument always controls the overall amplitude, then striking the key will control the total volume amount, the overall amplitude level. If I strike the key slowly, the note is soft. If I strike the key quickly, the note is loud. Velocity control of the amplitude. If this envelope generator were affecting the filter, instead of loudness, I would be controlling brightness. If this envelope were controlling pitch, instead of loudness or brightness, I would be controlling pitch. This parameter, TIV, or time number 1 velocity, controls the attack rate of the sound according to whatever parameter the envelope is controlling. In this case, because envelope 4 is controlling the overall volume level, this velocity sensitivity will determine the speed of the attack of the volume envelope. So for example, by engaging velocity sensitivity of the attack. If I play quickly, the attack will be quick. If I play slowly, the attack will be slow. Aftertouch is another keyboard feature that lets you change parts of a sound as you're playing the note. Aftertouch is engaged after you've already struck the note by pressing the key even further down into the bed of the keyboard. It's commonly used to control vibrato, in other words, the amount of the LFO, or sometimes even pitch bend. This is the Aftertouch page on the Korg M1. It allows us to control parameters like the pitch bend, the amount of LFO to the pitch, or the pitch modulation generator, the VDF cutoff point, that's the filter, the VDF modulation generator, that's LFO control of the filter, and the volume envelope amplitude. Let's see what happens when we control pitch bend using Aftertouch. Let's hear what happens when we control the amount of the LFO controlling the pitch from Aftertouch. As I raise the value, I can impart LFO to the pitch or oscillator by pressing down into the keyboard. This parameter enables us to control volume, or the level of the amplitude, according to Aftertouch. The Korg M1 also provides the ability to control that parameter in a negative range. So, for example, if we were controlling it with a negative value, its effect would be this. To decrease the volume instead of increase the volume. Aftertouch, control of the amplitude. Let's take a look at how the Roland D50 allows you to control pitch bend using Aftertouch. At the moment, it's set to 2 semitones. By pressing the key further into the bed of the keyboard, we can bend the pitch. This parameter is also adjustable up or down an octave. There's a third keyboard control which is called release velocity. Whereas velocity sensitivity affects sound according to how quickly you strike the key, release velocity affects sound according to how quickly you release the key. It generally controls the rate of the release portion of the volume envelope. Not too many synths have it though, so forget I said it. The sustain pedal is a kind of performance controller. When you step on it, it has the effect of slowing down the release rate of the volume envelope. The volume pedal is another performance controller. In many ways, it's identical to the modulation wheel in that it allows you to control the amount of something in real time. But just because it's called a volume pedal, don't let that make you think it can only control the volume. Depending on what optional routings your synthesizer might have, it could also control the amount of the LFO or the amount of brightness. Anyway, all of these different controllers do approximately the same thing. They let you change the sound in real time while you're playing. And they do that by affecting one of the 7 main components. 7 main components. That sounds familiar. Yes, those very same 7 main components that I've been trying to hammer into your thick heads for the past 3 hours. Don't be insulted, I'm just kidding. Not about the 7 main components, but about your having thick heads. Actually, if you've already gotten this far, you're doing pretty well. Or you fell asleep and left the VCR running. There's one other general feature that you're likely to find on most synthesizers today, and although I'd just as soon avoid the topic altogether, we really ought to talk about it. My reluctance to explain this feature is based on the fact that not only does every manufacturer under the sun call it by a different name, but each of them implements it in a different way. Anyway, aside from all that, it's really pretty simple to understand. Keyboard tracking allows you to affect part of a sound according to where you are playing on the keyboard. Here's a common situation. Say you design a great sounding synthesizer patch, but when you start to play it, you realize that although it sounds terrific in the middle 2 octaves, as you get higher and higher up the keyboard, it becomes much too bright. So bright that it's unusable. The high part might have exactly the same relative amount of filtering, but in that high range, it's still too bright. This is a job for keyboard tracking. In this instance, keyboard tracking, or key scaling, or key follow, allows you to alter the amount of filtering or brightness in a sound according to where you play on the keyboard. In effect, it allows you to make the high notes a little less bright, so that the entire keyboard is playable. The higher you play, the lower the filter. In addition to affecting the relative filter amounts, keyboard tracking, or keyboard scaling, or key follow, can also be used to affect relative volume, so that the higher you play, the quieter the note becomes. And it can also affect the relative envelope rate. In other words, it can determine how long a note is depending on where it is played on the keyboard. Here's an example. Let's hear what happens when we use keyboard scaling to control the decay of the volume envelope. Here's what this mallet sound sounds like without keyboard scaling. The length of the volume envelope is consistent across the keyboard. The volume envelope for this high C is the same length as the volume envelope for this low C. By engaging keyboard scaling, we tailor the keyboard so that the higher we get, the shorter the envelope. This effect mimics what occurs naturally on many acoustic instruments, which is that the higher you play on the keyboard or the instrument, the shorter the note becomes. Without, the length of all the notes are the same. With, the length of the notes shortens as we ascend the keyboard. Alrighty, so let's finally put all this stuff together and try to make some sounds. Let me give you an example of how to employ sync to make an electric guitar sound on this ancient analog synthesizer. Don't worry if you can't follow all the steps, just try and keep the basic concepts in mind. We'll start out by controlling the pitch of one of the oscillators. We do that by assigning the filter envelope to control oscillator A. That's because this synthesizer doesn't have its own pitch envelope, but the effect is the same. We're designing a pitch envelope to control one of the oscillators. Now what I will do is introduce oscillator B, and throwing the sync switch on, slave oscillator B to oscillator A. Listen to what happens to the two tones, one moving and one static, when they're synced together. As you can see, the effect of oscillator A's pitch bend is that now instead of the pitch changing over time, the timbre is changing slowly over time. That element alone is almost effective enough to be a convincing electric guitar. With a little fine-tuning, we can then turn this sound, with its dynamic harmonic movement, into an electric guitar.
First, I fiddle with the filter. Add a little bit of resonance, change the envelope amount. Reselect some waveforms. Rebalance the oscillators. Adjust the frequency of the LFO so that I can add it using the modulation wheel.
In the early days of synthesis on analog synthesizers, you had to design sounds from scratch. That's because your source material was limited to the 5 most common waveforms: your triangle wave, your sawtooth wave, your square wave, your pulse wave, and your sine wave. These days, however, the hybrid synths, like your SQ80, your D50, your M1, offer a wide range of sampled waveforms in addition to those 5 common waveforms. The point is that on today's hybrid synths, in many instances, it doesn't make sense to start from scratch because the waveforms available take you half the way there. But it is important, even if you're not making sounds from scratch, to know how to modify existing sounds. And that's an important part of what we're going to discuss here. So let's spend some time modifying existing sounds, changing one sound to another sound, to understand how the 7 main components work, even on the hybrid synths. All right, let's fool around a little bit with the Korg M1 and see how, by applying the principles of synthesis we've discussed, we can change an existing sound into another sound. Here's a brass sound. Let's change it into a cello sound. First, let's change the attack. We'll go to the volume envelope, VDA, EG, and slow down the existing attack from a value of 2 to a value of 49. See how simply by changing that one parameter, the attack of the volume envelope, we were able to turn this brass sound into a string-like sound. Now all I have to do is lower the frequency of the sound to put it closer to the cello range. I do that by going to the oscillator page, and where it says octave range, I lower it. See how we've turned a brass sound into a string sound by simply changing 2 parameters: the attack of the volume envelope and the frequency of the oscillator. Let's turn this pretty sound, sort of an airy string sound, into a funky bass. All right. Now I'm going to do this kind of fast, so try and follow what I'm doing. First, I want to go into the volume envelope and shorten the sound so that it's very abrupt with almost no sustain. I'll select envelope 4, which on this Ensoniq SQ80 controls the overall volume envelope for all 3 oscillators. First, I'll turn all the rates, or the time values, to 0. And now I will lower level 3, which is the sustain level, to 0 as well. There you go. Now you see what used to be a very nice sustained string sound is now a very abrupt little blip of an attack. I can increase that little blip of an attack by increasing the value for time number 3. Because as you see, level 2 is going to 0 level 3. The value of T3 determines the time it takes to get there. That's about enough. Now let's go to the oscillator section and change the frequency of all 3 oscillators. Let's lower the octaves. For oscillator 1, and now oscillator 2. And now oscillator 3. Actually, if we want, we could leave one of these higher. We still have a good bass sound with 2 of the 3 oscillators at a low octave. If we wanted at this point, we could go to the filter and fool around with a little resonance. We'll see what happens when we increase the resonance. Let's see what happens when we change the filter cutoff point. Now, if I wanted to, I could have the LFO control the filter cutoff point. Let's do that real quickly and see what happens to the sound. I'll use LFO number 1 as a source. You see, by increasing the amount of LFO to the filter modulation, I might also want to slow down the frequency of the LFO. You see how each note has a different kind of filter setting because the LFO is changing it gradually over time. All right, let's compare the sound we have now with the original sound. You can see how drastically a sound can be changed and modified by simply altering the values of a few select parameters. Understanding in advance what effect a parameter will have on a sound is what sound design is about. Remember, all I did to change this sound to this sound was adjust a few parameters. I changed the frequency of the oscillators by dropping the octaves. I changed the volume envelope by removing the sustain. And I altered the filter by modulating it with the LFO. And that's it. Let's try turning this metal harp sound on the D50 into a more sustained pad. First, let's examine what each of the individual oscillators are doing, or the 4 partials. By muting 3 of the 4 partials at a time, we can isolate individual partials to hear what they're made up of. Three of the 4 oscillators in this sound, or partials as they call them, are dedicated to PCMs, or digital samples. The 4th, lower tone partial number 2, is dedicated to an analog waveform. Let's go into partial number 2 and extend the volume envelope of that analog waveform. Remember, we want to turn this abbreviated harp sound into a long sustained pad. I've entered the edit parameters for partial 2. I notice two parameters, TVF, which is time variable filter, and TVA, time variable amplifier. This is the filter envelope and the volume envelope. Get accustomed to recognizing those common parameters under different guises. Let's extend the volume envelope. I enter the parameter, and I see a page that gives me times and levels. Let's turn all the levels up to maximum. We put sustain at 100, and just to make sure, level 3 and level 2. Automatically, we hear that the envelope of the analog waveform has been extended so that it sustains. Let's examine the filter envelope and the filter. I access the TVF parameter, and we see a parameter for the filter cutoff frequency. See how by raising the filter, we make it brighter. By lowering it, we make it duller. Let's start out low and use the filter envelope to design a shape for our brightness. Let's also throw in a little resonance. The resonance will become more apparent once the filter envelope has been designed. We cycle through pages until we see the times and the levels of the filter envelope. Let's see what happens when we slow down the initial time, or time number 1. Let's add release to both the filter envelope and the volume envelope. That will be the last rate, time number 5. You won't actually hear the release portion of the filter envelope until we've also gone to the volume envelope and extended that as well. Let's do that. Let's add the other partials to see how they're sounding with the waveform we've designed. Finally, let's add some LFO to the sound. We can modulate the filter cutoff point. We can modulate the pitch of the oscillator. We could also modulate the width of the pulse wave. We are dealing with a square wave, or a pulse wave in this instance. Let's see what happens when we use the LFO to modulate the width of that waveform. This page allows us to manipulate and to modulate the pulse width of the square wave, or the pulse wave in this instance. The pulse width itself can be changed. And we can also introduce modulation from the LFO number 1, 2, or 3. This is LFO number 1. Let's add LFO depth and see what happens to the sound. Without. We've just added pulse width modulation from LFO number 1 to the square wave in this sound, or the pulse wave in this sound. Hear the internal motion that it adds to the sound. Let's go back and examine the settings for LFO number 1 and see how we can further alter the kind of pulse width modulation that we hear. We access the LFO parameter, and we see familiar variables. We have waveform select, either a triangle wave or a random waveform, or a square wave, or a sawtooth wave. Let's stay with the random waveform. You can also manipulate the rate of the LFO. It can be slow or fast. And we can introduce a certain amount of LFO. Here's what our single partial, or our oscillator, sounds like with a modulated pulse wave, an extended volume envelope, and a little bit of resonance in the filter. Let's reintroduce the original partials, the other 3 oscillators, into the sound and see what's become of what used to be a harp sound. Let's compare what we've arrived at with the original harp sound. Hello, wake up, wake up. Hi there. Just trying to get your attention, make sure you haven't snoozed. Let's turn this nice bass sound into a helicopter. We'll do that by adding an enormous amount of filter modulation. First, let's go to the filter and select an LFO as one of its modulating sources. LFO number 1. Let's make sure that we increase the LFO amount to maximum. Now, let's go to LFO number 1 and set its level amount. Son of a gun. That sounds familiar. Let's slow down the frequency a little. Not bad. See how simply an understanding of LFO and its ability to modulate other components enables us to change a sound from one thing to something entirely different by simply changing a few values. Here's a nice organ sound on the Core Gam 1. Let's play with this organ.
Dean.
Let's modify the organ sound and see what different kinds of organs we can come up with simply by changing some of the parameters we've already discussed. In order to change the sound of this organ patch, let's first turn it from a single oscillator sound to a dual oscillator sound. We change that single to double. Now let's look at the second oscillator, oscillator 2. Now it's a piano. But let's select organ 1 to go along with organ 2, which is an oscillator 1. All right, so in oscillator 1, we have organ 2. In oscillator 2, we have organ 1. Right away, you can hear how the new double sound is richer than the original single sound. Here's the sound with both organs. Let's go to oscillator 2 and see what happens when we change the octave range of organ number 1. Again, you can see the many different variations we have of combining these different organ sounds at different octaves. It's like pulling stops out of a regular organ. What happens if we detune oscillator 2 from oscillator 1? We select the detune parameter. See how even a slight amount of detuning can make the already rich sound even richer. Let's now go to the LFO and see whether we can add a lot more frequency modulation or tremolo to the sound directly from the LFO. We cycle through the pages until we reach pitch modulation generator. We select intensity, or LFO amount, and dial it in, and hear what happens to the organ sound. Let's minimize that a little bit, but you can hear the effect. It's turning this into a really modulated organ. Here's the organ without LFO, and here's the organ with a little bit of LFO. Let's speed up the frequency of that LFO and see how it sounds. Now let's compare the organ sound we have now with the original single oscillator organ sound. That's the original. That's the original. And here's the one we've edited. It's not that one is better than the other, but one of them is drastically different than the original. And we achieved it simply by manipulating the parameters of sound that we've talked about, those 7 main components. First, we selected 2 different waveforms in a dual oscillator system. Then we changed the frequency of one of those waveforms. And then we introduced frequency modulation from the LFO. Let's see if we can turn this brass envelope into some kind of synth tom-tom by using some noise, manipulating the pitch envelope, and changing the volume envelope. First, let's design a descending pitch envelope. We go into the pitch envelope and slow down the rate at which the pitch envelope moves from step 1 to step 2. Rates go to levels. As you can hear, one of the oscillators has a pitch envelope which is descending. Let's duplicate that in oscillator number 1. Now let's add some noise. Let's shorten the volume envelopes of oscillators 1 and 2. What we do is find the last rate going to the last level. In this case, we've assigned it as step 2. And we shorten the speed that the envelope cycles. We could spend a lot more time refining this drum sound, but essentially hear the difference between what we started out with, a brass sound, and what we wound up with simply by adding noise, adding a pitch envelope that descended, and shortening the volume envelopes. We went from here to here. Anyway, folks, that's pretty much it. There are a lot of synths out there, old and new. And I've tried to arrive at some basic concepts that pertain to most, if not all, of these. Understanding the 7 main components is crucial to working with any synth. And you're bound to run into 3 or 4 of the 5 most common waveforms, no matter where you go. And remember, if it's a synthesizer, and it was manufactured on the planet Earth, then one way or another, it's going to have to somehow address the 3 elements of sound: pitch, timbre, and volume. Speaking of pitch, drop us a line and get on our mailing list. Then we'll be able to keep you posted about future instructional videos from the New York School of Synthesis. And if you have a particular question that you'd like answered, send us a self-addressed stamped envelope, and we'll try and answer it for you. And if we don't know the answer, hey, we might just keep your stamp. Ha ha ha. Nah, just kidding. We'll give you back your stamp. Anyway, this is Dean Friedman. That's my name, by the way. I'm not the dean of the school or anything. If I was, they'd have to call me Dean, which would be kind of silly. Anyway, thanks for listening. And to all you tintinnabulating synthesists out there, happy programming.